In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. I, Anthony Burgess, am making my first confession for 55 years. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned exceedingly in thought, word and deed.
Anthony Burgess is een van de belangrijkste hedendaagse Engelse auteurs. 52 boeken heeft hij op zijn naam staan, maar beroemd, of is het berucht, werd hij na Stanley Kubrick's verfilming van zijn boek A Clockwork Orange. Burgess, ook journalist, essayist, componist, werd dit jaar 70. Bij die gelegenheid verscheen het eerste deel van zijn memoires Little Wilson and Big God, dat eindigt in 1959, wanneer de auteur terugkeert uit Maleisië om fulltime schrijver te worden. Het tweede deel, waarvan de publicatie voor volgend voorjaar gepland is, zal eindigen in oktober 1987, toen hij, na vele jaren, opnieuw geconfronteerd werd met zijn geboortestad Manchester.
The book calls Little Wilson and Big God. I can understand who is Big God, but who the hell is Little Wilson?
Well, I am Little Wilson because my full name is John Anthony Burgess Wilson, and when I was working in the Colonial Civil Service in Malaya and wanted to publish a novel, it was felt that it was indecent for a Colonial Civil Servant to use his real name on the book cover, so I used my mother's name, or rather my two middle names, Anthony Burgess.
Burgess is the maiden name of your mother.
Indeed it is so, yes, Burgess. A good old French name, bourgeois. Besides, there are far too many Wilsons in England, you know. A lot of writers call Wilson, Angus Wilson, Colin Wilson, and so on. Unfortunately, there are too many Burgesses, especially Guy Burgess, the defector to Moscow, who is a distant cousin of mine. When people are told, you know, that there is the name Anthony Burgess, they always think it's Guy Burgess, you know. Or Anthony Burgess, the great spy defector.
Burgess groeide op in Lodge Street, een van de meest gore buurten van Manchester. Later verhuisde het gezin naar Princess Road in Moss Side, nu een Caribische slum.
None of the shops here are the shops that I used to know. It was always a street for shops. Shops for working class people.
Does it hurt you to come back here?
Yes, it hurts me to the heart. Because this was, although it was working class, poor, it was respectable. They tried to keep things clean. There was no sense of decay. But now, look, everything's falling to pieces. Although we were poor, we were never lacking in sexual vitality in this part of the world. And I think that still goes on. Probably all that is left for the working class after the hard day's work is a bit of sex. What the Italians call the poor man's opera. But here I was taught, when I was about 5 years old or 6 years old, by nuns. And I remember in particular there were two nuns. There was Mother Andrea, who was very gentle and said if we were good children we would go to heaven. But the headmistress was Sister Ignatius. She was like a fishwife. She used to call the Hail Mary as though she was crying the price of fresh halibut. I said, "You're going to hell, boy." And we believed in hell. If you eat meat on a Friday, you will go to hell. And we believed this. And to some extent I still believe it, because the lessons you're taught at that age in this kind of school are there with you.
Were you at that time?
Oh, I was here at the age of 5 or 6, and I left about the age of 11 when I went to another school. But the great Catholic lessons were taught here at a very early age. This is a good example of intercity decay. I mean, here there was a Freemasons' hall. Look at it now. Here there was a beautiful cinema called the Palace, and my father used to play the piano there for the performances. Look at it now.
There's nothing left.
Vulgarity, God knows what they show inside, probably pornographic movies, decay. And then eventually we come to this horrible patch of waste ground where I used to live. This is the horror of coming back. The poet said, "Never go back." But I've come back and this is what I see. I used to be there as a small boy. I used to sleep up there. My father sold tobacco there, but now there's nothing left. It's all gone.
Your parents, did they have much time for your education?
No, they didn't believe in education much. There was no tradition of education in the Catholic families of Manchester. My family were essentially entertainers. My father had been a pianist here and in music halls. My mother, who was dead, had been a dancer. So there was no question of reading books or getting a literary education. Hello. And
so what happened with you if they didn't have time for you?
oh, a certain strength of mind and a certain ability and a certain love of books. Probably one had to escape from this kind of environment by reading. Reading Treasure Island, Gulliver's Travels, escaping. And I suppose this still continues. Literature for me is a kind of escape from the real world. I want to escape from this real world. I have to escape into the past, when this place existed as a street full of living people. Look at it now, it's a street of ghosts.
Burgess' kinderjaren werden voor een groot stuk bepaald doordat hij opgroeide in een pub die gehouden werd door zijn stiefmoeder. Zijn vader kwam trouwens in pubs aan de kost als pianospeler. Daarom wilde Burgess nu terug naar een pub en dat de piano niet gestemd was, vond hij onbelangrijk.
My poor father used to play the piano in a pub, as I'm doing at the moment, or I'm going to do, but he also played in the old silent cinema, you know, and the kind of piano he had was rather like this. He never prepared his music beforehand, he always made it up as he went along, and he never saw the film he accompanied before the performance. So it was rather like this, you know, be looking up at the screen and he'd be playing. Time and at the end. And then at the end, the big. And at the end, always. Yeah. But in a pub, he was pretty much the same. He used to play.
What kind of music did you play there? Popular songs?
Popular songs of the day, but you know, songs that were sort of traditional.
And did he have to sing as well?
He did sing rather badly, as I sing, something like this, you know. The song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the whispering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, sad the day and long, still to us at twilight comes love's old song. Love's old sweet song. Badly, sung badly, but that's what they wanted.
But he was your introduction to music, wasn't he?
Well, Manchester was a musical city, you see. I mean, apart from pubs and cinemas, music halls, we had the Halley Orchestra, as we still have here. And this orchestra was possibly the best in England. It may have been, at one time it was the best in Europe, in the 1930s. And I used to go with him as a child to hear concerts, but it was usually Wagner. Wagner was the big Manchester composer, you know, the master singer. And so on, you know, that kind of thing. Big orchestra, good brass, fine string section, and that's where I first had that kind of music. But there were two kinds of music. There was this sort of horrible popular music, and there was the other kind. Had to live with the two, as it were.
But your father, he was a composer as well.
My father only wrote one piece that I know of. That was the regimental march for the Royal Flying Corps, which came in the First World War. But for the rest, he was a frustrated musician. He was always intending to compose something. He was always intending to become more than a mere piano player. He wanted to be a pianist, you know, a real pianist as well, not striking wrong notes all the time. But that was never fulfilled. The ambition was never fulfilled in me. It's only with my son, finally, that we have genuine music in the family. He's an oboist. He plays in orchestras. He's learning music in London. So finally, my father's ambition failed in him, failed in me, but has succeeded with my son. So I'm pleased about that.
Because already at the age of 13 or 14 you decided that you were to become a composer.
Yes, but never for this instrument. I never saw myself as a kind of Chopin or Beethoven. I loved the orchestra, and I used to go to the public library and learn from books there how to compose and how to orchestrate, and the first things I produced were big orchestral scores. I still do that now. I can't play them on the piano, you get a totally false idea. But that kind of music, that kind of, you know, popular music.
Normally you're playing standards.
Well, you call them standards.
Yeah.
Now. Nobody, you know, that's all it. That kind of thing. Standard, yes, not rock, not pop. No.
Yes, there's a quote in The Piano Player,
Yes.
which says one should play the piano of love with the skill of a Horowitz.
Well, that was the idea. That's what the book is about, that most people think they can make love without having learnt it, but nobody thinks he can play the piano without having learnt it. Nobody can sit down and say, right, I can play the piano. But everybody thinks he can take the body of a woman and make love to it without learning how to do it. That's what the book was about.
Is it correct that you entered literature through music?
Well, yes, a piece of music. My father believed that he could teach the violin to children very easily. You know, the four strings of the violin are these. He said that if you could take these four strings and add the piano accompaniment to them, you had a chance of teaching a child how to play a melody, you know, from the very first lesson, like this. So on, you see. All the child does is to play on the open strings. My father's aim was to write a course for children so they could learn the violin very quickly. That comes in the novel, but he never did it. He was discouraged. He took to beer and playing in pubs, and that was his life. I was brought up in this atmosphere of hard drinking, hard fighting, and very great ugliness.
Do you agree that an unhappy childhood is a writer's goldmine? It's one of these
They
statements.
say that some of the great books of all time have been written out of unhappy childhoods, like the novels of Charles Dickens, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, the novels of James Joyce, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But I think personally I'd rather have a happy childhood and not write books about an unhappy one.
Na de lagere school werd de jonge Anthony gestuurd naar het katholieke Xaverius College. De starre leefregels en doctrine van de paters maakten dat zijn collegetijd zo'n traumatische ervaring werd dat hij het er een halve eeuw later nog altijd moeilijk mee heeft.
When myself and my companions first came to this school, we saw the Latin language for the first time, and we saw it in the form of the school motto, which says, Concordia res parvae crescunt. By concord, little things grow big. But what struck us was the last four letters of the last word, C-U-N-T, cunt. And of course, this, in a way, was the opening of our sexual lives. There was no sex in the school. This was a boys' school. It was run by Xaverian brothers with white collars and black soutans. And they were dead against sex. If you had lust in your heart, you went to hell. But for all that, we were growing up and we found sex outside. We found extramural sex. We found it among the prostitutes who were very cheap. It used to be called 10-penny Tessa, 9-penny Nell, 11-penny Liza. Girls who would do it for a meal of fish and chips. But eventually I found my sexual education beginning in a very low way with working girls, with maids, with nobody refined. And I've always associated sex ever since with dirt, and certainly with sin.
But you got your education also at the pub where you lived.
Oh,
There
indeed,
were
yes.
mates were...
Well, yes, this is probably the only way a young boy in those days could get his sexual education, was if you got for 12 shillings a week, which was not very much money, a girl to live in the house, to work in the house. You could probably get some sexual education from her. I did. Indeed, my parents were so stupid that they made me sleep in the same room as the maid. When I was 13, and there was a maid there of 18, a hot-blooded Welsh girl, I mean, what was the outcome? The outcome was a premature sexual education. But the job of this school was to repress sex. Sex was a terrible thing. Again, all the books we read in school were about sex. Shakespeare was about sex. Homer, Virgil, all these were about sex. So there's always this perpetual fight, perpetual conflict between one's natural instincts and what was expressed in literature and in the language itself. Concordia res parvae cres cunt. On our very first entry into the school, there was a great word. In my youth, we were very ignorant about sex, and our first sexual experiences were disappointing, chiefly because we were so excited. It was such an exciting experience. And we were subject, all of us, to what is called premature ejaculation. I discovered when I was about 15 or 16 that the best way to hold back in the sexual act was to recite to myself some of the poetry of Milton. You know, avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold. And get through 14 lines. If you did that, you did pretty well.
And does it still help you?
At my age, well, sex, don't let anybody tell you that sex dies with youth. I mean, sex goes on to the end, as you know. There's even sex after death, so they tell us. No, I don't have much difficulty now.
But you were not talking about homosexuality.
As far as we were concerned, homosexuality did not exist, except, as a matter of fact, with the headmaster of this school, who was a covered homosexual, and with the stupider young boys of the school would indulge in acts of overt sexuality in his study, but we didn't believe homosexuality existed. We thought it was some perversity which could never enter our lives.
In one of your books, Early Powers, the main character is a homosexual. He's a 70-year-old writer, Kenneth.
Well, in fact, he's 81, as I remember, an 81-year-old homosexual. Well, this causes trouble because I do not know what it's like to be a homosexual. I don't think any heterosexual man does.
But you don't condemn it?
Hmm?
You don't condemn it?
No, I don't condemn it. But there's something in me still which I've gained from this school and from my Catholic education generally, which makes me feel that it's probably against nature. Aristotle said that the purpose of sex is procreation. We are given the sexual impulse so we can breed and let the race continue. But of course, homosexuality denies this. And in that biological sense, of course, it's wrong. I don't condemn it. But I've always found it very, very difficult to, as it were, insert myself into the personality of a homosexual. Here, with the solitary exception of our headmaster, Brother Martin, of the Order of St. Francis Xavier, we were terribly and frustratedly heterosexual.
But since you had a Catholic education, normally Catholics say that sex is only for procreation, it's not allowed for joy.
Well, that's what we were taught. I mean, at the church I went to, you could buy a penny pamphlet called Sex and the Catholic Family, and the first words were, sex is a good and holy thing, and pleasure in sex is an admirable thing, if sex is devoted to the procreation of children. But sex as an end in itself is evil, and the easiest way to condemn yourself to eternal punishment is to regard sex as an end in itself. It's taken me a long, long time to realize that that's probably wrong.
So you felt guilty about it?
Guilt is terrible. I mean, it was bad enough as a child at the Billsborough Memorial School, feeling guilty about eating meat on a Friday, or being late for mass, or missing my night prayers. But when sex came into the picture, the guilt was tremendous. And I think I've spent my entire career as a writer trying to work off this guilt. At the age of 70, it's getting a bit late now to think in terms of guilt at all, but the guilt is still there.
And even worse is that you start to feel guilty about feeling guilt.
Oh, well, you feel guilty about feeling guilty about feeling guilty. I mean, it's a Chinese box. But sooner or later, one has to realize, when it's too late, that you can't build your life on guilt. But on the other hand, I think you make art out of guilt. I think guilt is a great dynamo. And it is one of the dynamos that's always pushed me in the direction of producing literature. So I can't condemn guilt altogether, and I can't condemn this place altogether.
Voor het milieu waaruit Anthony Burgess komt, was het niet gewoon om te gaan studeren aan de universiteit. Burgess nam zelf de beslissing om het te doen, daarin wel gesteund door zijn vader. Aan de universiteit ontdekte hij twee passies die er ook nu nog zijn: de fascinatie voor talen en voor de media.
I was a bad student. I was a very bad student because a university is a place not only to study but to work with other students at the things you like. I was a great journalist in those days. I was editing the university magazine, learning about printing, about the correcting of proofs, editing. I was concerned with the drama and with music. All these practical things were, to me at that time, rather more important than my studies. I was not a good student, but eventually they made me a doctor at this university.
Did your literary taste change in all those years?
My literary taste has hardly changed at all. When I came to this university, I brought with me a love for two writers who were not well liked. One was James Joyce, who was still banned. You could not buy his books in those days. And the other was a Jesuit poet, Catholic poet, called Gerard Manley Hopkins, who wrote English as though it were a kind of Dutch. And these were my two gods when I was about 20. And at the age of 70, 50 years later, they're still my two literary gods.
Especially James Joyce.
Especially James Joyce. But James Joyce, of course, lived in a town like this. Dublin is rather like this city. Dirty, decayed, poor, not like an Italian city, Catholic. And at this university, in this city, I felt very much drawn to that man.
Het oeuvre van Burgess heeft twee grote thema's: seks en het katholicisme. Zijn houding tegenover het christendom is erg ambigu. Hij fulmineert tegen God en gebod, zweert zijn geloof af, maar toch laat dat geloof hem nooit helemaal los. Twee redenen daarvoor: zijn katholieke opvoeding is ontzettend diep geworteld en hij ziet voor zichzelf geen alternatief.
Remember that Napoleon Bonaparte was asked later on in life, what was the most important day of his life? They thought he would say, when I won a great battle, Austerlitz. And he said, no, gentlemen, the most important day of my life was when I made my first communion. It was the most terrifying day of my life for me because we were taught that this piece of bread was the body and blood of Jesus Christ, and we believed it. And I still half believe it. And the prospect of taking this into one's mouth was terrifying. And the rule, as you know, about not eating or drinking before you took this communion was so strict that sometimes if I was walking in the Manchester rain to this church to take communion, and rain would drop in my mouth, I thought, I've taken in water. I dare not take the body and blood of Christ. I'll be damned eternally. There was always that sense of possible damnation connected with even the first communion.
Did you know already at that time what the Bible was?
Catholics are not supposed to read the Bible because it is on this question of the Bible that the great split of the Reformation began, isn't it? I mean, the Reformers said everybody has the right to interpret the Bible in his own way. But the Jesuits, especially here, said, no, the Bible is private property. It is for us to read, for us to interpret. It is for you to obey.
But you were supposed to know the Catechism of Christian Doctrine.
The Catechism was something that was etched onto our minds. I can still recite it.
What
Who
is
made
God?
you? Who made you? Who made you? God made me. Why did God make you? God made me to love him and serve him in this world and to be happy with him forever. What is God? Who is God? God is a supreme being who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfection. I can go on for hours with that.
When did you lose faith?
I began to lose faith probably one day in this church on a May Sunday. On the first Sunday in the month of May, it was customary to honor the Blessed Virgin. And flowers would be put into the church. There would be a statue of the Blessed Virgin crowned with flowers, and a little girl would be dressed up as the Virgin Mary, and they would sing hymns to the Virgin Mary. And I thought, God, this is pagan. This is not Christian. They're honoring a pagan goddess. And for the first time, I think the doubt began to be sown in my mind. It was in this church, certainly. And it was to this church that I came for help. After all, the Jesuits were supposed to be great theologians, and I came, what can I do about the situation I'm in? I no longer believe. I was given no help, and eventually a priest said to another priest, poor boy, but it's the old story, it's a question of little Wilson and big God. This became the title of my autobiography.
Even though he was aware of our sinfulness, of our weakness, of the mistakes that as human beings we would make, he still founded it so that it will be the source of salvation for everyone.
I've no right to condemn the church. I mean, I'm too small. I'm still little Wilson, and there is big God. But the church has always seemed to me to be inhuman. There's an intellectual strength about it, but there's an emotional coldness. And emotion only seems to strike the church when it's a question of condemning. Although we're told that God loves us, that God is love, I never found much love in the church. Intellectual rigor, but no emotional warmth. And I think this still continues.
But in early powers, there's a pope.
Yeah, there is indeed a pope.
Carlo Campanati.
Yes,
but
yes.
It seems to me that he's based on the life of John the 23rd.
Yes, I had Pope John the 23rd very much in mind when I wrote the book, and what started me writing the book was just a very simple idea. What would happen if a novelist like, say, William Somerset Maugham, very rich, very famous, mediocre, homosexual, had as brother-in-law a man like Pope John the 23rd? What would be the relationship? And then I pondered this question of evil. Supposing a young boy is saved from death by a miracle, by a papal miracle, by a priestly miracle, and then becomes a bad man, responsible for the deaths of millions or thousands of people. What do we feel about God? Does God know about it? Is God responsible? Is God responsible for evil? Is God responsible for the deaths of the millions of Jews in the concentration camp? We know nothing about God. And yet this question is there. If God is love, why is God also hate? These are the questions that began to trouble me in this church, in these confessionals, trying to argue things out with priests who are normally reading the racing results in the evening paper. We don't have to choose it. We are totally free to choose between good and evil. This was the theme, this has been the theme of many books I've written. The freedom exists. Even though God knows everything, we're still free.
But for you there's a difference between evil and sin.
No, they're the same thing.
Same thing.
In the sense that evil is something that exists in the world, and an act of sin is just a desire to embrace evil. But sin itself is such a vague, vague term. The sins I committed when I was a boy, they're jokes, they're laughable. But the great sins, the great evils, well, history is the medium through which these are portrayed. Great sins exist. Evil exists. This is why I cannot altogether leave behind an institution like the church which tells us that evil exists. We're told that it doesn't exist. We're told that we can easily get rid of it, that it's a result of bad education, bad environment. Evil is a force. Possibly the devil exists, I don't know. But this church still stands as a kind of monument for that system of belief, which I can never really lose.
Just a personal question, is it true that after so many years you don't want to be a Catholic anymore, and to some extent you still are it?
Nobody wants to be a Catholic. If you're going to be a Catholic, you have to start believing in heaven and hell. Nobody wants to believe in hell. Nobody minds not going to heaven, but everybody objects very strongly to going to hell. And the basic teaching, and this is probably very northern and very Irish, which I had in churches like this, and schools like the ones you've seen, was that hell exists. And that hell is very, very painful, and hell goes on forever. And it's not easy to drive that out of your mind. Hell still haunts me, and always will. Hell, hell, hell.
Na de oorlog, toen hij in Gibraltar zijn militaire dienst deed, is Burgess nooit meer teruggegaan naar Manchester. Hij trok naar Londen, maar daar heeft hij zich nooit helemaal thuis gevoeld. De stad liet en laat hem onverschillig.
There's a strange thing. Graham Greene, Drell, you, the three greatest English novelists of the present day. Now they decided they have chosen to leave England and to live abroad.
There are various reasons for this. The press in England believes that a writer going abroad is trying to escape taxation. This is not true. I mean, every writer pays taxes wherever he publishes. But there was a sense, I think on the part of Graham Greene and myself, that England had become a foreign country, that because we were Catholics and England was Protestant, we felt more at home in France, Italy, than in England. There's also another fact which people very rarely take into account. That is, if you're writing in the English language, you can best write it if you separate the language from the people who speak it. So that to write in English when you're surrounded by Italian or German or French is a better thing to do than if you're living in a country where the language is spoken all the time.
England doesn't like his authors too much.
Well, England never has liked its authors too much. It's never taken literature seriously. And as far as the state is concerned, the government is concerned, I think it fears writers. Writers tell the truth, and governments don't tell the truth. So at least England is honest enough to admit that. When you have in England twice a year the honours list, when people are made into Sir this, Sir the other thing, Lord so-and-so, it's usually jockeys or football players who become lords and knights. Writers no. Writers are dangerous.
Burgess was 30 jaar oud en zonder vaste job toen hij besloot om voor het Britse Colonial Office te gaan werken in Maleisië. Zijn taak daar, leraar.
Kala.
If.
If. How do you say it?
If.
Again.
If.
Again.
If.
Is that right?
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
Is that good?
Yes.
We are very lazy people in England. We are very lazy people, and when we pronounce our words, we do it rather like this. If you go up, we don't say if you go up river, which is rather it's as though you're standing to attention. If you go up river, too strong. We are very slack, very lazy. If you go up river.
Op persoonlijk vlak was de periode in Maleisië voor Burgess nogal tragisch. Vooral dan door het alcoholprobleem van zijn eerste vrouw.
Give me a
What did the tropics learn to you? I mean, I would say.
Well, the tropics were supposed to ruin my health. I mean, I was sent home eventually from the tropics, but made me drink too much, as always happens in the tropics, but taught me that the European is an exception. The European is an eccentric. The real people are the people in the East. The real world.
Why are they?
I don't know. It's because it seems to be natural that one should live in a warm climate, that nature should keep you warm, nature should look after you, that the Malays didn't have to work. The coconuts dropped from the trees, or they sent up monkeys to bring them down. Fish were jumping in the river. There were 3 rice crops every year. An incredibly rich country. They had the seasonal festivities, you know, the fast once a year, Ramadan, then the great day of rejoicing when Ramadan was over. There was a cycle of life, which was very, very natural, a natural cycle. And I still look back on the Malays, if not on the Chinese, as representing the kind of ideal situation for humankind.
Now, soon after your first novel was published, you went back to England.
Yes, indeed.
So you came as a teacher and left as a writer one.
That's beautiful, yes. I went there as a teacher and came home as a writer.
And how was it to write
Back in
after you
England?
were back in England?
Well, writing is always difficult, but there was something strange about being back in England at all. The cold, the food, the white faces. Everybody looked diseased.
But you also thought that you were suffering of a tropical disease, no?
No, I was told that I had cerebral tumor. I was told that I had a cancer of the brain, and that I had a year to live, but this turned out to be untrue. In that year, though, when I thought I was going to die, I did write rather a lot. I wrote 6 books.
6 books in 1 year?
Oh, yeah.
How could you manage it?
Oh, well, you can do it. I used to do them before breakfast. If you write 2,000 words every day before breakfast, you could easily get, well, work it out, 720,000 words in a year. 720,000 notes, more than that. It's 720,000 words a year. It could be 10 books.
Your career as a professional writer started in 1959. Do you have any idea how many books you've written in all those 30 years?
I published in English 52. 52 books is too many. But overproduction is necessary if you're going to live.
What motivates you? The money?
No, not really. It's the only thing I can do. When I was sent home from Borneo in 1959, I had no job because I was going to die, you see. And the only job you can take on if you're going to die is that of a writer. So when I lived, I was still a writer.
But being a writer, you consider yourself to be as a journalist as well?
Well, this is part of it. I think the writing of a book is a very lonely business. You will spend a lot of time, you don't see people. And you become so solitary that you need to make contact with the world through the odd article, through the odd interview, in fact, through journalism. I think we all have to practice journalism to live. And there's no shame in it because, in a sense, William Shakespeare was a journalist. He was producing what was needed as quickly as he possibly could for the London audience. And this goes on. There's no shame in it. Journalism is something we have to do. We have to do it as well as we can, I think, because the standards of journalism are pretty low. If a serious writer takes it over, it means he's setting a standard to lowlier journalists.
But if I calculated quite well, you made about 7.5 book reviews a month. You made articles.
They come and
Do
they
you ever
go.
sleep?
Well, what I like, I think any author likes this, the business of being called upon, of being needed. And what has happened to me on television as well as with newspaper work is to be called upon to do a job very, very quickly because nobody else can do it. When the Pope was shot in Rome, in 1 hour I had to produce 2,000 words of journalism for a newspaper here. They knew that nobody else could do it. I'm a fast worker when I have to be, and I write moderately well and moderately truthfully. This is something I'd rather prize, because to be useful in that sense, to be able to produce the thing immediately, is a test of one's professionalism.
Burgess werkt als journalist, schrijft scenario's voor de televisie, werkt voor het theater, kortom is een broodschrijver. Rijk is hij helemaal niet, ook niet na het kassucces A Clockwork Orange. Zijn troost is dat ook Shakespeare om den broden schreef.
This place we're sitting in, Broadcasting House in London, was the model for the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's 1984. And when Orwell worked in the BBC, he did most of his broadcasting to India from Room 101, and in 1984 that becomes the great torture chamber. So when I come here, I can't help shivering a little because Orwell saw the possibilities of corrupting the truth, making lies into truth, and using this medium for dominating the brains of the entire country. But this has not happened in the BBC. We're still a liberal country.
But are you pessimistic about television? Because you once wrote that television will kill culture.
Well, I felt that at one time, and I still feel that it's a great deal too easy to take in one's information and one's entertainment through television. There is a tendency in television, as there is in cinema, to oversimplify, to make things a little too easy to understand.
But do you agree that your literature is kind of performance? Paul Theroux said that.
Literature is performance, yes, indeed. I mean, we're When we write a book, we're all on the stage, in a sense. We're presenting ourselves, we're jumping around, we're showing how clever we are, showing how much we know about human life and so on. It is performance, yes. But it's not just performance. There's more to it than that. We're not always, when we write books, trying to captivate the reader all the time, you know, holding on to him. If the reader finds certain difficulties in what we write, well, that's what we want. We want the reader not to, as it were, swim in a clear river, but to meet obstacles occasionally, to meet stones and strange fish. But the tendency with a lot of modern entertainment is to give them something easy to swim in.
Does it irritate you that you became famous with this book?
Yes, yes, a great deal. Yes, it is not a book that I would prefer to go down to posterity as the sole author. I've written other books, but this book for some reason appealed to the young at the time.
You became famous not because of the book, but because of the fuss around the film.
It was chiefly the fuss about the film. I mean, Stanley Kubrick, who made the film, in his cunning way, was determined to stay out of the picture. He had made the film. Now leave the publicity, leave the discussion to somebody else. He left it to me, who was the author of the book and hence was supposed to know something about it. But I then became associated with violence. I was always receiving telephone calls blaming me. If anybody was raped or murdered, it was my fault. It was the fault of the film. I said, I didn't make the film. I mean, yes, but you wrote the book, and without the book, there would have been no film. This was unjust because, as I'm always saying, a work of art cannot cause crime, cannot cause violence. The violence is already there. All that the author does is to present it, show what it's really like. It can't create a situation. And I think that literature and art in general has been very unjustly blamed for crime. There was a man in New York many, many years ago who murdered, I think it was 60 children. And when he was caught, he said he was much influenced by the Bible. He'd read about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. And he was trying to sacrifice his children to God. Well, what do? Get rid of the Bible? There was a young man who murdered his uncle, also in America, and he said he'd done this after seeing Laurence Olivier's film of Hamlet, which is about killing one's uncle. What do? Get rid of Hamlet? There was a lady in this country, Lady Snow, the wife of the novelist C.P. Snow, Pamela Hensford Johnson, who said that if by getting rid of all the books in the world we could prevent the murder of one child, we must do it. I don't think it's true. I think we have to take our chance on this.
Did you work for theatre as well?
I have worked in the theatre. Indeed, I started my artistic career partly as a musician and partly as a theatre director. I've worked in the theatre in America and would in many ways like to go back to theatre. But with the theatre, as with the film world, you're up against this problem of working with other people. And the great joy of being a writer is that you're alone. You're totally alone. Nobody can tell you what to do. Nobody can say, change this line, change that line. There is a tendency in America for publishers to regard the writing of a work of fiction as the production of a piece of raw material, which then the publishers will knock into shape. When I sent my manuscript of a novel some years ago to the American publisher, I got a reply from the editor saying, now, thank you for this first draft. Now we will work on it and turn it into something else. I said, if you touch one comma in that manuscript, I will cancel my contract. The novelist is entirely alone, entirely in charge, and he must not allow anybody else to interfere with this work. In the theatre, in the film world, in the television world, it's different. It's a cooperative business, and it's weakened because of the combination of various brains is no substitute for the single brain that sees it all and is in charge of everything. For my part, the great battle, far greater than any battle fought over this city, is the battle between good and evil, which is waged in our own souls, waged in the world, waged through history, but it's the only battle worth engaging in. We have to fight evil. We haven't to fight wrong. It's evil. There's an active, diabolical force in the universe.
In het verleden heeft Burgess zich ook op de profetische toer gewaagd, maar omdat van zijn voorspellingen in 1985 bijna niets is uitgekomen, is hij nu toch voorzichtiger geworden. Alleen dit. Hij verwacht geen nucleaire holocaust, maar verder is hij niet al te optimistisch.
Very soon we'll enter the 21st century.
Yeah. You will, I won't. I don't think so.
You never know.
I
But
don't know.
any idea how it will be?
I don't know. You see, the fact is, now at the age of 70, I understand what the American writer Alvin Toffler means by future shock. The future comes in upon us into the present, and we recognize it with a terrible shock. We're not ready for it. There are too many things happening now which I am not ready for. I get shocks when I witness even small things like the power of the computer. All these electronic devices which are changing our lives, by the immense growth in population in various countries. I would not be such a fool as to attempt to prophesy the future, but by the year 2000, we can expect that the forces of electronic invention will be more and more powerful. The computer will become more and more inhuman, more and more dominant. And that we will be in a situation that's already beginning, that people will have nothing to do. Unemployment on the increase, and education failing by not preparing people for leisure, either enforced or taken freely.